When I first stumbled upon a forgotten document in a private estate archive, I had no idea it would completely shatter everything I thought I knew about economics. This wasn't some dusty academic paper or theoretical treatise. This was an internal memo from 1863, written by one of the most powerful banking families in history. A memo that was never meant to see the light of day. The document was clinical, direct, almost surgical in its precision. But what it revealed wasn't just banking strategy. It was evidence of the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. A way of organizing society that had created the most magnificent architecture humanity has ever seen, without using what we consider money at all. I spent months verifying this document's authenticity, cross-referencing it with historical records, tracing its provenance through multiple sources. Every test confirmed what I already suspected. This memo was genuine, and what it described was nothing less than economic warfare against communities that had found a way to thrive without banks. The more I researched, the more I realized we've been told a fundamental lie about human civilization. We're taught that money is natural, that banking systems are inevitable, that there's simply no other way to organize complex societies. But standing in the shadows of Europe's greatest cathedrals, examining structures that took decades to complete with thousands of skilled workers, I kept asking the same question. Where are the payment records? These weren't small projects. We're talking about massive undertakings that employed entire communities for generations. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and carved with extraordinary precision. Timber needed to be sourced, shaped, and fitted. Metals had to be mined, smelted, and forged into intricate, decorative elements. Skilled craftsmen spent their entire careers perfecting techniques that we still struggle to understand today. Yet when I dove into the archives, when I examined the meticulous records these projects left behind, something was consistently missing. The financial documentation. Not lost, not damaged, not incomplete, simply absent. As if these monumental achievements were accomplished through an entirely different system of human organization. That's when I discovered the guild economy. Not the simplified version we learn about in history classes, where guilds are portrayed as primitive trade associations. The real system, a sophisticated network of mutual obligation and collective provision that functioned across continents for centuries. A system that created abundance without debt, security without accumulation, and masterful craftsmanship without monetary incentive. But here's what made this discovery truly unsettling. This system didn't gradually fade away through natural evolution. It didn't become obsolete because something better replaced it. It was deliberately, systematically, and violently destroyed. Not by accident, not by progress, but by design. The banking interests of the 19th century understood something crucial about guild economies. They represented an existential threat, not to prosperity, not to advancement, but to control. You cannot control people who don't need to borrow money to survive. You cannot extract wealth from communities that share resources collectively. You cannot charge interest to craftsmen whose needs are provided by the system they contribute to. So they didn't try to compete, they destroyed. Between 1865 and 1900, laws were passed across Europe that fundamentally transformed how human labour could be organised. These weren't gradual reforms or natural developments. They were coordinated legislative attacks designed to criminalise alternatives to monetary exchange. Suddenly, it became illegal to work in exchange for provision, training, or access to collective resources. Every labour arrangement had to involve payment in official currency that flowed through banking systems where it could be tracked, taxed, and controlled. Guild properties were seized, their records were burned, their members were scattered into factory wage work, and within a single generation, a system that had created humanity's greatest architectural achievements was almost completely erased from memory. What replaced it wasn't more advanced or efficient, it was more profitable. For banks, for the people who controlled money, and could now extract value from everyone else's labour. But for the craftsmen themselves, for the quality of their work, for the security of their communities, it was an absolute catastrophe. I found production records that document this transformation with brutal clarity. Cities that had completed multiple major building projects every year through guild organisation suddenly struggled to finish half as many with twice the workers. The quality declined so dramatically that architectural historians still mark the 1880s as the beginning of what they politely call the decline in traditional craftsmanship. More workers employed, fewer projects completed, significantly lower quality results. This wasn't progress. This was systematic degradation disguised as modernization. But the most revealing evidence came from an unexpected source: objects that everyone assumes were coins, sitting in museums across Europe, catalogued as currency from the pre-industrial period. Except when you examine them closely, nothing about them functions like money at all. They're too perfect for hand-struck coins, too standardized for the technology supposedly available. They show no wear patterns despite being centuries old. And most importantly, they're not marked with monetary denominations. Instead, they carry geometric symbols, craftsman's tools, and what appear to be coordinate systems or angular measurements. These weren't coins, they were proof of mastery within the guild system, proof of contribution, proof that you had achieved a certain level of skill and were entitled to certain provisions from collective resources. You couldn't buy these tokens, couldn't trade for them, couldn't accumulate them like wealth. You earned them through demonstrated expertise, through years of contribution to the community, and they were completely non-transferable. When you died, your token returned to the guild. It couldn't be inherited, couldn't be sold, couldn't become capital that generated more wealth. This is the exact opposite of how money functions. Money is designed to be transferred, accumulated, and turned into more money through investment and interest. The guild system operated on contribution rather than extraction. You gave according to your ability and skill level. You received according to your needs and demonstrated mastery. The entire economy ran on the principle of mutual provision rather than individual accumulation. This brings us to the central question that modern economists cannot answer honestly. If this system worked so well, if it created such extraordinary results, if it kept people secure and purposeful, without generating the poverty and desperation we accept as normal today, why did it disappear so completely? The answer lies in that 1863 memo and the coordinated campaign that followed. Because powerful people understood that guild economies represented something far more dangerous than competition. They represented the possibility of freedom. Freedom from debt, freedom from interest payments, freedom from the endless cycle of borrowing and repayment that keeps populations controllable and dependent, able and dependent. The mechanisms of this destruction were far more sophisticated than simple legislation. Banking interests understood that to eliminate the guild system permanently, they needed to attack its philosophical foundation. They couldn't simply outlaw collective provision. They had to make people forget it was even possible. Consider what happened to the apprenticeship system. For centuries, young craftsmen learned their trades through direct mentorship, living alongside masters, absorbing not just techniques but entire worldviews about work, community, and human purpose. This knowledge transfer happened organically, through daily interaction, through watching, practicing, gradually mastering skills that took decades to perfect. The banking system couldn't monetize this relationship. There was no loan to be made, no interest to be charged, no debt to be collected. A master stonemason teaching an apprentice represented a complete economic transaction that occurred outside the monetary system entirely. The master received respect, legacy, and eventual support in old age. The apprentice received knowledge, housing, food, and gradual integration into a stable community. Factory wage labour systematically destroyed these relationships. Suddenly, training became the employer's expense, something to be minimized rather than cherished. Workers were deliberately kept interchangeable, replaceable, prevented from developing the kind of specialized expertise that might give them leverage or independence. The deep knowledge that guilds had preserved for centuries began disappearing within a single generation. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. I found evidence that this wasn't just happening in Europe. Similar systems existed worldwide, and they were all being dismantled during the exact same historical period. Indigenous communities across North America operated sophisticated gift economies, where status came from giving rather than accumulating. Pacific cultures maintained elaborate networks of reciprocal obligation that distributed resources efficiently across entire regions without using currency. Every one of these systems faced systematic suppression during the late 1800s. Colonial governments banned traditional ceremonies, criminalized non-monetary exchange, forced populations onto individual land holdings that could be taxed and controlled. The pattern was global and coordinated, suggesting a level of international cooperation among banking interests that historians rarely discuss openly. What emerges from this research is a picture of deliberate economic colonization. Not just the conquest of territories, but the conquest of economic imagination itself. People had to be taught that money was natural, that accumulation was inevitable, that there was simply no other way to organize complex societies. The evidence against this narrative stands all around us. Every cathedral built without bank loans, every guild hall constructed through collective labor, every piece of infrastructure created through contribution rather than transaction. These structures didn't just survive the transition to monetary systems, they outlasted them. Many are still standing centuries later, still functional, still inspiring awe in everyone who encounters them. Meanwhile, the buildings we construct today under the banking system require constant, expensive maintenance and become obsolete within decades. We've been taught to see this as progress, as efficiency, as the natural result of advancing technology. But when you compare the longevity and beauty of pre-monetary construction with modern buildings that fall apart before they're even paid off, the supposed advancement becomes difficult to defend. The guild economy produced masters whose skills became legendary, whose techniques we still study but cannot fully replicate. The banking economy produces workers who are trained through brief orientation periods and deliberately kept replaceable. Which system actually sounds more sophisticated when examined honestly? I discovered that remnants of contribution-based systems still exist today, operating in spaces the banking system hasn't fully captured yet. Open source software represents perhaps the clearest modern example. Millions of programmers contribute code without payment, creating operating systems and development tools that literally run the internet. Not for wages, not for profit, but for reputation within the community, for mastery of their craft, for meaningful contribution to collective resources. These digital guilds face constant pressure to monetize, to privatize what contributors created freely. Corporations continuously attempt to capture and commercialize open source projects. The pattern mirrors exactly what happened to physical guilds in the 19th century. First marginalization, then legal challenges, then forced integration into monetary systems. The same dynamic plays out in Creative Commons movements, cooperative housing projects, time banking networks, where people exchange skills without using money. All of these alternatives work effectively, where they are allowed to exist, but they're systematically prevented from expanding through zoning laws, tax codes, and banking regulations that require everything to be documented and valued in currency terms. This reveals something crucial about our current system. It's not that alternatives to monetary exchange don't work. They work extraordinarily well. The problem is they're not allowed to succeed because their success would demonstrate that banks are unnecessary, that debt is optional, that we could organize society around contribution and provision instead of scarcity and control. The transformation from guild economy to banking system wasn't just an economic shift. It was a complete restructuring of human relationships. Under guild provision, your security came from your community's abundance and your contribution to collective projects. Under banking systems, your security depends entirely on individual accumulation and your ability to outcompete everyone else for limited resources. This shift created artificial scarcity where none existed before. Guild commons provided abundant access to workshops, tools, materials, and knowledge for anyone willing to contribute their labour and develop their skills. Banking systems require you to purchase access to everything separately, ensuring permanent dependency on monetary income that can be controlled through interest rates and employment conditions. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. People went from seeing work as a form of artistic expression and community contribution to viewing it as a necessary evil, something to be endured in exchange for wages that never quite cover all expenses. The deep satisfaction that comes from mastering a craft and seeing your work carry forward through generations was replaced by the anxiety of constant economic insecurity. But perhaps the most profound loss was the elimination of genuine retirement security. Guildmasters never feared old age because the system guaranteed provision, regardless of current productivity. Your status and access to resources increased with experience and wisdom. Elderly craftsmen became teachers, advisors, repositories of knowledge that younger members could draw upon. Banking systems offer no such guarantees. Your security depends entirely on individual savings that may or may not prove sufficient, that can be destroyed by inflation, market crashes, or medical emergencies. The anxiety this creates shapes every decision throughout your entire working life, preventing the kind of long-term thinking and patient skill development that guild systems naturally encouraged. We're approaching a critical moment in this investigation because understanding what was destroyed is only the beginning. The real question becomes whether these systems could function in the modern world, whether we could rebuild economies based on contribution rather than extraction. And the answer to that question threatens everything the banking system has built over the past century and a half. What happened next in my research changed everything I thought I understood about modern resistance to economic alternatives. Because I found evidence that the banking system didn't just destroy the guild economy once. They've been destroying it continuously, systematically eliminating any attempt to rebuild contribution-based systems wherever they emerge. Take what happened in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, when the banking system had clearly failed millions of people, communities across America began spontaneously organizing barter networks, local currencies, and mutual aid societies. These weren't theoretical experiments, they were practical solutions that actually worked. People traded skills for goods, created local scrip that circulated without interest, established community workshops where tools and knowledge were shared freely. The federal government's response was swift and decisive. Executive orders criminalized most forms of local currency. Tax regulations were modified to make barter transactions prohibitively complex to document. Banking laws were expanded to require federal oversight of any organized exchange system. Within 5 years, most of these grassroots alternatives had been legislated out of existence. But here's what troubles me most about this pattern. Every time these systems emerged, they demonstrated remarkable effectiveness. Communities that organized mutual aid networks weathered economic crises better than those dependent entirely on monetary systems. Local currencies kept wealth circulating within communities instead of being extracted by distant banks. Skill-sharing networks created resilience and self-sufficiency that reduced dependency on corporate employers. Yet none of this success mattered. What mattered was maintaining the monopoly on economic organisation that banking interests had established through the destruction of the guilds. Any alternative, no matter how successful, represented a threat to that monopoly and had to be eliminated. This brings us to perhaps the most sophisticated mechanism of guild economy destruction, the transformation of education itself. Because guild knowledge wasn't just technical information, it was a complete way of understanding human purpose, community obligation, and the relationship between individual skill and collective well-being. Traditional apprenticeship created what we might call philosophical craftsmen, people who understood their work as contribution to something permanent and beautiful, who saw mastery not as a way to earn more money, but as a responsibility to the community that had invested in their development, who measured success not through accumulation, but through the quality and lasting impact of their contribution. Modern education systematically eliminates this perspective. Students are trained to see knowledge as private property, skills as competitive advantages, work as a means to individual advancement rather than collective benefit. The entire structure of contemporary schooling prepares people for wage, labour dependency rather than contributory independence. Even more revealing, we've lost the vocabulary to describe guild economy relationships. We literally don't have words for many of the concepts that made these systems function. The idea that provision could be guaranteed without payment, that status could increase through teaching rather than accumulation, that security could come from community abundance rather than individual savings. These concepts have been so thoroughly erased from economic discourse that most people struggle even to imagine how they might work. This linguistic elimination wasn't accidental. Banking interests understood that to maintain their monopoly permanently, they needed to control not just economic practice, but economic imagination. People had to forget that alternatives were even theoretically possible. I found internal documents from major banks during the early 1900s that explicitly discuss this strategy. Memos recommending funding for economic research that would establish monetary exchange as natural law. Correspondence about supporting educational curricula that presented banking as inevitable rather than optional. Strategic discussions about marginalizing any academic work that examined pre-monetary economic systems seriously. The result is that, even today, when people encounter evidence of guild economies, their first instinct is to explain it away rather than examine it carefully. Surely there must have been hidden payments. Surely the records are incomplete. Surely there's some way to fit these achievements into the monetary framework we've been taught to see as universal. But what if we stopped trying to force guild evidence into banking categories and instead examined it on its own terms? What emerges is a picture of economic sophistication that makes our current system look primitive by comparison. Guild economies created genuine abundance through collaborative efficiency. Instead of competing for limited resources, craftsmen shared knowledge, tools, and workspace to maximize collective capability. This eliminated enormous amounts of waste that monetary systems create through redundancy and competition. Consider how many separate workshops exist in modern cities, each equipped with similar tools, each operated by individual craftsmen who must purchase and maintain their own equipment. Guild workshops served entire communities through shared infrastructure that was maintained collectively and used efficiently. The same principle applied to knowledge transfer. Instead of each craftsman guarding trade secrets to maintain competitive advantage, guild masters were incentivized to share everything they knew because their status increased through successful teaching. This created rapid advancement in techniques and continuous improvement in quality that individual competition cannot match. Material sourcing operated through similar collaborative networks. Instead of each craftsman negotiating separately for stone, timber, or metal, guilds coordinated bulk acquisition and distribution. This reduced costs dramatically while ensuring consistent quality across all projects. But perhaps most importantly, guild economies eliminated the enormous overhead costs that banking systems impose. No interest payments on borrowed capital. No insurance premiums to protect against market volatility. No accounting expenses to track monetary transactions. No legal costs to enforce contracts and collect debts. All of this economic efficiency was redirected into actual production. More resources available for materials, more time available for craftsmanship, more energy available for innovation and artistic expression. The result was higher quality output achieved with less total input than monetary systems require. Yet we're taught to see this as primitive, as somehow less sophisticated than a system that requires people to borrow money at interest to purchase access to resources that could be shared collectively. The more I studied guild production records, the more I realized that what we call economic progress since the Industrial Revolution has largely been an illusion. Yes, we can produce more units of standardized goods, but we've lost the ability to create works of lasting beauty, permanent utility, and genuine cultural value. Guild cathedrals are still standing and still inspiring after 5 centuries. Modern buildings require replacement within decades. Guild craftsmen created techniques so advanced we still study them, but cannot replicate them. Modern workers are trained to operate machines designed by others and maintained by specialists they never meet. Which system actually represents advancement when measured by meaningful criteria rather than mere quantity of production? This question becomes even more pointed when you examine the human cost of each system. Guild craftsmen worked within communities that guaranteed their security, valued their contribution, and preserved their legacy. Modern workers face constant economic anxiety, job insecurity, and the knowledge that their labour primarily benefits distant shareholders rather than their own communities. The guild master, who spent 30 years perfecting stone carving techniques, knew that his knowledge would be passed to apprentices who would carry it forward and improve upon it. His work contributed to structures that would stand for centuries, with his name literally carved into the stone. His old age was secure, regardless of market conditions or personal savings. The modern factory worker produces components for products designed to become obsolete, using techniques that can be replaced by automation at any moment. His knowledge is deliberately kept limited to prevent him from becoming irreplaceable. His security depends entirely on continuing employment in markets designed to eliminate his job whenever possible. We've been conditioned to see the second scenario as natural, inevitable, the result of technological progress, rather than deliberate policy choices. But the guild economy proves that technological capability and human security are not mutually exclusive. Advanced craftsmanship and community provision can coexist and reinforce each other. The question then becomes why we abandoned a system that produced better results with greater human satisfaction. And the answer always returns to the same fundamental issue. Guild economies couldn't be controlled by banking interests. They had to be destroyed, not because they didn't work, but because they worked without generating profit for financial institutions. This destruction continues today through mechanisms so subtle we barely notice them. Zoning laws that prevent workshop sharing, professional licensing requirements that criminalize traditional apprenticeship, tax codes that make skill bartering prohibitively complex, building codes that force individual ownership of tools and workspace. Every regulatory barrier makes collective provision more difficult and individual purchase more necessary. Every legal requirement forces more economic activity through monetary systems where it can be tracked, taxed, and subjected to interest charges. The result is artificial scarcity imposed on communities that could organize abundance through cooperation. We're prevented from recreating guild-style economies not by practical impossibility, but by legal prohibition. Yet examples keep emerging wherever regulation hasn't yet reached. Maker spaces that share expensive equipment, tool libraries that eliminate individual ownership requirements, skill-sharing networks that connect people directly without monetary mediation. Community gardens that provide food through collective labour rather than individual purchase. All of these initiatives face constant pressure to formalise, monetise, and integrate into banking systems. The pattern never changes. First, marginalisation through lack of funding, then legal challenges about insurance, liability, and regulatory compliance. Finally, forced conversion to fee-based services that destroy the contributory relationships that made them effective. But here's what gives me hope. Despite this systematic suppression, these alternatives keep appearing spontaneously wherever people have the freedom to organise them. The impulse toward mutual aid and collective provision seems to be fundamental to human nature. Banking systems require constant enforcement to maintain their monopoly because cooperation is actually more natural than competition. The guild economy wasn't an ancient anomaly that became obsolete through progress. It represented principles of human organisation that remain valid and effective wherever they're allowed to operate. The question isn't whether these systems could work in the modern world. They already do work in every space where they haven't been criminalised yet. The real breakthrough came when I discovered what happened to the physical infrastructure itself, because when banking interests dismantled the guild system, they didn't just scatter the craftsmen or seize the properties. They systematically erased the technological knowledge that made guild production possible in the first place. I found inventory records from guild workshops that were confiscated during the 1870s. These weren't simple collections of hammers and chisels. They contained specialised tools we can barely identify today, let alone reproduce. Precision measuring devices that maintained accuracy across decades without modern calibration systems. Stone-cutting equipment that achieved tolerances we struggle to match with computer-controlled machinery. Metalworking apparatus that produced alloys whose composition we still don't fully understand. But here's the disturbing part. These tools weren't sold or redistributed. They were deliberately destroyed. Melted down, broken apart, scattered as scrap metal. It was as if banking interests understood that preserving guild technology would make it possible for craftsmen to reorganise independently, outside the wage labour system they were trying to establish. The knowledge destruction went even deeper than physical tools. Guildmasters maintained detailed technical manuscripts, accumulated over generations, documenting everything from architectural principles to material preparation techniques. These weren't just instruction manuals. They contained centuries of experiential knowledge about how different materials behaved under various conditions, how to achieve specific aesthetic effects, how to create structures that would remain stable for hundreds of years. When guild properties were seized, these manuscripts vanished. Not lost accidentally, not damaged by time or neglect, systematically removed and destroyed. I found court documents from the period that specifically mention the confiscation and disposal of guild technical libraries. The reasoning given was that such knowledge represented unfair competitive advantages that prevented free market competition. Think about the implications of that statement. Centuries of accumulated human knowledge about craftsmanship and construction, knowledge that had created the most beautiful and durable architecture in history, was classified as unfair competition and deliberately eliminated. Because that knowledge allowed craftsmen to work independently, without requiring loans for equipment or training, without generating profit for banking institutions. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Within 20 years of guild dissolution, the quality of European construction declined so dramatically that contemporary observers noted it in newspapers and government reports. Buildings that should have lasted centuries began showing structural problems within decades. Decorative techniques that had been passed down through generations were lost permanently. But the banking system presented this decline as progress. They argued that standardized factory production was more efficient than individual craftsmanship. That mass-produced building components were more affordable than custom guild work. That wage labour was more democratic than apprenticeship systems. None of these arguments address the fundamental question of quality and durability. Factory-produced materials might have been cheaper initially, but they required constant replacement and maintenance. Standardized components might have been more uniform, but they eliminated the adaptive techniques that allowed guild structures to withstand centuries of environmental stress. What we gained in short-term affordability, we lost in long-term value. What we gained in production speed, we lost in craftsmanship mastery. What we gained in individual wages, we lost in community security and collective knowledge. The evidence stands before us in every cathedral spire, every guild hall, every stone arch that has endured for centuries without a single bank loan. We didn't lose the Tartarian economy through natural evolution or technological progress. It was systematically destroyed because it worked too well without generating profit for those who control money today. The question isn't whether these contribution-based systems could function in our modern world. They already do, wherever they haven't been criminalized yet. Now you know why they had to vanish.